Okay, so, well, I have to say it is with huge pleasure that I'm introducing here Michel Bauwens, because I actually tried to invite Michel for like most of those events, and every time, I guess Michel is really busy and could not make it. But the reason why I really wanted Michel to come to those events is because I think there is a lot of discussion around the blockchain and mainly around the Bitcoin part of it. And to some extent, it has stigmatized a lot of the discussion that goes on more deeply into the blockchain with this concept of libertarian approach to it. And one of the main reasons that actually I got interested in the blockchain was actually to look at how it could go much further than that and how we can benefit this more common-based approach to this. And so Michel Bauwens is the founder of the P2P Foundation. And I think it's important he's going to bring here a more critical vision of the blockchain in terms of what is the good thing that it can bring, but also what are the dangers and how can we actually use it for more common-based approach in a reasonable way without actually incurring the danger of commodification, etc. So I let it to Michel. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's the 15th century. And there's a guy called Luther who says, "Thank God for the printing press." You know, what did he mean, right? What he meant was, I think, that until that time there had been many heretical movements within the Christian churches, but they've always been repressed. But because he had this new tool, he could spread this heresy, if you like, faster than the centralized institution of its time, the Catholic Church, could repress it. So for the Reformation, even though the printing press did not create the Reformation, it's a very complex techno-social process, the tool was actually very, very important, right? And I think today something very similar is happening with the internet in general. The way I would look at it is, in 1973, the microchip gets invented. But basically, pretty much until 93, it was the private players, the big multinational companies who could do networking. And so the first phase of neoliberal globalization is really the result of that, right? It's the ability to reorganize supply chains through IT that gave us this neoliberal globalization model. Since 93, with the browser, civil society could take over the internet. Not, of course, absolutely not completely, but it gave rise to other ways to use the technology for other aims and other interests. And so one of the things I think that's important about the blockchain, and if you put it in a historical context, is about, if you think about communication, coordination, and transaction costs, right? So think about bike sharing. Bike sharing was invented or maybe tried the first time by the Provo movement in Amsterdam in the 1960s. It was called the white bikes. And they tried it many, many times and it never worked. The reason it never worked is, maybe that's the tragedy of the commons in a way, is because some people would steal those bikes and they had no way to do anything about it. The cost of maintaining this common resource was prohibitive. Now we know there are more than 4,000 bike sharing cities. Some of them have up to 400,000 bikes, like in some Chinese cities. Why is that? Well, it's because the intention has now matched with the technology that allows people to know where those bikes are, and therefore the coordination and communication costs of maintaining that commons, that shared resource, has become interesting enough to choose bike sharing over bike ownership. So I think if you look at the sharing economy, the physical sharing economy, this is what is happening. And this is something I would call P2P exchange economy, which is about individuals exchanging value amongst each other as individuals, like Airbnb and Uber. But there's also another economy which I think is more potent, to actually answer the last question we had in the last panel, which is about social justice. So just to give you my thesis is potentially the blockchain could be the tool to bring down the transaction cost of human collaboration to a level where civic self-organization can become the dominant way of value creation in our societies. But that in itself is not going to solve social justice. So I want to explain how that works. And maybe you can look at Bitcoin as an example, right? There's many ways to critique our libertarian friends, and I won't go into details. But here is one very important thing. It's not enough to have a level playing field in a distributed system, because it will always lead to the power law and oligopoly. Think about Airbnb. Less than 10% of the exchanges are from individuals with excess capacity. 90% are now huge professional organizations. It's not really peer-to-peer in that sense. Think about the so-called long tail that we were all excited about 10, 15 years ago. You know, the famous book of Chris Anderson. iTunes doesn't have a long tail. Amazon doesn't have a long tail. Spotify doesn't have a long tail. Because the forces behind these companies do not want a long tail, and they design against a long tail, right? Think about double page ranking in Google. It reinforces what is already popular. So far from distributing, it's actually creating more monopoly. And this is, as we know, what happened with Bitcoin. Bitcoin, that's theoretically is a peer-to-peer currency, actually has a higher inequality coefficient than sovereign money, and it's getting ever more unequal. It's not. So I'm very skeptical of people saying, well, you know, it doesn't do it now, but it's going to do it in the future. You look at all the trends, and it's not doing it at all. It's actually going in the other direction, creating more inequality. And so if you don't look at countermeasures, at measures to maintain equality, what you actually get is the democratization of rent extraction. This is what is happening today, giving more people the chance to get a piece of that pie, right? So think about what is happening in our physical world around gentrification. This is a very typical example of rent extraction. So you have a bad neighborhood, cheap rent, so lots of young people and artists go to live there and create a buzz. Before you know it, real estate investors find out that something is happening in that neighborhood. They start buying up properties, and before you know it, the prices of the houses are so big that the original people who created the value in the first place have to leave that neighborhood, right? This is really what's happening online as well, and this is, so you have a lot of people creating common value in these shared resources, and if there is not a fair way to distribute the value, an active fair way to distribute the value in a fair way, you get rent extractions at the edges of those commons. So this is kind of the issue that we're dealing with. So what can we do against it? Now, just a few examples if you look at history, which I think can give some reason for certain optimism. We look at hunter-gathering egalitarianism. You know, that lasts for tens of thousands of years. You know, so we had there a system with very low status differentials based on gender and age, but basically no class societies, a fairly egalitarian way of doing things that lasts for, I don't know how long, but I'm sure there's some experts here who can help me. But if you look at the books around this, for example, The Hierarchy of the Forest of Christopher Bohm, or Societies Against the State from Pierre Clastres, what you see as these societies, these so-called horizontal societies, were actually reverse hierarchies. It was the beta males and the women who coalesced against the dominant males to create regulations that kept this tendency in check. That's what happened, and they did that successfully. Just an example, if you were a hunter in some Amazonian tribes and you would bring back this big beast, you brought it to the village. You were the last to choose what piece you got. So you got a reputation, but the system was organized to avoid the accumulation of resources within that tribe. I was in Dubrovnik. So this is another thing you think about Athenian democracy, the medieval guild democracies in the free cities in the Middle Ages. Each of them lasted about 3 centuries. That's not bad, right? 3 centuries of fairly democratic, fairly egalitarian functioning. But here is what I found out in Dubrovnik. In the Middle Ages, the mayor of Dubrovnik was imprisoned. They put him in a villa with soldiers, and everybody who came in out of his house was noted. And this was an active measure against lobbying and corruption, right? So just to give you an idea that this is the kind of things we have to look for. So for example, in music, and I don't know if that service still exists, I haven't checked it for a while, the one service, music service, that has a long tail is called Jamendo. And it was a Creative Commons music site in France, and they had counter algorithms, right? So for example, the first 10,000 people would choose a song would have 1 vote. From 10,000 to 100,000, you needed 10 people for 1 vote, and then et cetera, et cetera. So they creamed off the top to get a long tail distribution in an active way. So here's my thesis, is that the commons economy may be our best chance to do this at scale. So what is the commons economy? This is what we have today. So there is an American report called the Fair Use Economy Report that has calculated that the economy of shared resources, so this is not the P2P exchange economy that came a bit later with Airbnb and all of that stuff. This is the P2P commons economy. So in other words, economic streams that grow around the edges of shared resources. 1/6 of GDP with 17 million workers. That was in 2011. And it didn't calculate the new sharing economy. But if we look at how this commons economy is emerging, we still have serious issues. So if you look at the slide here, and maybe maybe very quickly, just to give you some background. This is what I use as a tool to recognize value-sensitive design in peer-to-peer networks, right? You have a vertical axis. You have global versus distributed control of peer-to-peer infrastructures and technologies, and you have for-profit versus for-benefit orientations in this design. Think about the internet, started with soldiers by the army, DARPA, and the non-commissioned officers were saying, well, you know, if it's war and we can't talk to our general, we better have a system that's resilient and we can talk to our peers. So paradoxically, this highly centralized socialist institution that is the US Army created the distributed platform. It's a paradox of history. Then the scientists took it over. They said, wow, we can use this. And they started putting cables. It wasn't actually designed that way, but they started putting cables between their offices in order to use that infrastructure to share scientific communication. And then you have the browser, and all the users come online, and they also start changing the logic of the internet. And then business says, wow, there's a lot of people there. We can create business around this, and they create a layer of client-server around the original distributed infrastructure. So we see that when a technology is not neutral, but it can be used by various people and various interests with different values, and then it becomes an area of conflict and of choice. So a way to look at this, so think about, and it sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Centralized control of peer-to-peer technologies. But think about Facebook. Today, the mass migration in Europe of Syrians and others is almost entirely organized with secret Facebook groups. Where to go, what roads to take, what buses to take, what trains to take, where to sleep, where to get food, what borders are closed, what borders are open. It's almost entirely mapped out through this peer-to-peer aspect of Facebook, just as the Egyptian revolution was. But if we look at the exchange value of Facebook, I think there's something wrong with it, because an empty platform would be valueless. So very clearly, it's us, our communication, our interaction, which is the basis for the value extraction model of Facebook, right? And none of it is actually reinvested in the community. So this is something I call the crisis value, the value crisis, which is that more and more people are enabled and empowered to create use value themselves, create shared resources, but the monetization of this is only growing linearly and is being captured by some players who actually are not reinvesting in the communities that create those shared resources. This is in a way a tragedy of the commons of our age. And it's bad for everyone, because if you're selling services and products and nobody has any money to buy your services, well, goodbye to you too, right? So this is not something that's going to lead us very far. And we now have this kind of wave of netarchical capitalism, that's the way I call it, the hierarchy of the network, where you have Airbnbs that are not investing in hospitality. They're not building anything. You have the Ubers who are not buying and building cars. We have the YouTubes who are not producing videos, and the Googles who are not producing documents. So basically we have a rent extraction scheme of companies that capture the value of human cooperation without sufficient reinvestment in the people who actually do the contributing. Then we have distributed capitalism, which is the dream of Bitcoin and of the blockchain in a way. And again, the idea is to enable individuals to create value, exchange value, assets, to exchange them over the network. But because there isn't any countermeasures in those systems, we get oligopoly, monopoly, even though it starts always as a distributed system. So Airbnb, less than 10% of the people are individuals with apartments. Social lending, entirely dominated by the banking world already, right? So all these streams of peer-to-peer disintermediation actually is not giving that. It does have certain advantages, but it's certainly not giving us this dream. So in the commons economy, it works the following way. There were also two good ones, but I'll talk about them later in the other quadrants. So here's the thing. More and more people are joining open contributory systems, creating common resources. The Wikipedias, the Linuxes, the Arduinos, the Wikispeeds, the Wikihouses, etc., right? 1/6 of GDP. But the forms of capture of value are problematic. And so we get exclusionary financializations. Can we do something about this? Sorry, this is very small, but I couldn't find another one. So if you have good eyes, this is the secret model, trademarked, about how to do things in the right way. You can invest, talk to me later. All right, so here's what we're working on. Here's what the P2P Foundation is working on. Here's the question. Can we find, instead of extractive business models or the democratization of rent extraction, can we find generative business models, right? Can we find people who think, can I create livelihoods and businesses while co-creating these shared resources, right? So you have peer producers, commoners, that are participating in these open contributory systems, and then you have the market players who create value-added products and services around these common goods, right? For example, geolocation in the US, it's a public good. The geographic information of the government is shared by all, and it creates a vibrant economy of geolocation applications around it, right? That's how it works. So commons are not, even though the commons are outside the market, because they're abundant, there's no tension between supply and demand. Around it, there's room for different kinds of markets. So I learned something recently when I was listening to Tina de Moor, a Belgian commons historian, because I kind of assumed that commons were eternal until they were, actively destroyed by both capitalism and socialist governments. And they may have been in some way, but actually the commons that we know in Europe, the farmers' commons, these common lands, they didn't always exist. they were pretty much invented or reinvented in the 11th century. So suddenly you see a wave of farmers mutualizing land, even though they're still dependent and have to relate to their feudal lords, and they have also their private land. But they're massively creating this mutualization. About a century later, in the 12th century, there is a massive creation of guilds. I also thought they were eternal. No. So what happened? Well, what happened is what's happening today. And I call this the emergence of ethical entrepreneurial coalitions. My favorite one is Enspiral in New Zealand, where I spent 12 days. And here's how it works. So here's how the peer-to-peer economy, commons economy work. At the core of the value creation, you have productive communities of people, paid or unpaid, who are contributing to a shared resource. Around these commons, you have these entrepreneurial coalitions, which can be extractive or generative. And then we have for benefit associations, like the Wikimedia Foundation, the Linux Foundation, which maintain the infrastructure of cooperation, right? This is the model of the commons. This is how it almost nearly always works. So here's Enspiral. The commons of Enspiral is Lumio, a open source democratic decision-making system for virtual communities that we are using in the P2P Foundation. Because it's very hard to make decisions if you're not together in a physical space. The other one, which I'm starting to use, is called co-budgeting, which allows networks to reinvest in network projects. They may have other commons that I'm not aware of. But the whole community of Enspiral, which is at the core 50 social entrepreneurial people and companies, they are creating mutual aid amongst their members through these mutualized infrastructures. And they have a commitment to each other to help each other. Around these commons of Enspiral are 18 business ventures. 18 social entrepreneurial business ventures which have a common tagline, stuff that matters. So they want to actively solve social and ecological issues. And then we have the Enspiral Foundation. And the Enspiral Foundation is their enabling for benefit association that maintains the overall dynamics and infrastructure. So this is interesting, right? Because there we have people who are creating livelihoods, and they grew from 50 to 250. They're creating livelihoods around these shared resources with a new type of mindset. I think they are neo-guilds. Some people call them Neotribes. And so what is interesting to observe, and this is really what we do in the P2P Foundation, is what are they doing? How are they solving their issues? What kind of new technologies and infrastructures are they building? And it's really fascinating, and we have 20,000 articles about this, which have been viewed 30 million times. So I think there is an interest out there for this emergence. Here is a few examples. One, I would call it contributory accounting systems, because this is the rent extraction that happens typically in a commons community. So I'll take a very simple example. My friends in the P2P Foundation who do our translations, and they're called guerrilla translation. Half of their time is spent doing free translation of commons texts from English to Spanish and Spanish to English. So they have a bridge function between these two language domains. And they have an accounting system for their contributions. It's very easy in this case. It's just the number of characters. You just jot it down, and there you go. So around a dozen people are creating this collective value. They have an extraordinary good reputation now, and they do things very well. And they're always bitching about other translators. So that's the proof that they're better. And so what happens now is that publishers connect with them and say, for example, Think Like a Commoner from David Bollier. Can you translate this for us? So these are all well-meaning people, but so this is what you get, right? You get two people, maybe three, who are going to get the market contract based on a collective social value. And no matter how well-meaning you are, this is actually an extraction of a common rent, right? So here's how they do it. 15% of the market income goes into the contributory accounting system. So it's based on a fair social contract. May not be perfect, but it's out there. And Primavera, I see she's sitting there, was explaining to us in the panel just before how Backfeed is a blockchain-based attempt with tokens to create a contributory accounting system using the blockchain, right? So you see the relation there, that the blockchain could be used in those contexts. Okay, this is maybe not directly related to blockchain, but maybe you can think with me and see what's possible there. So here is something that's happening with the license that we use in the commons world, in the open source world. The more communistic the license, the more capitalistic the practice. Why is that? Well, if you use a copyleft license, what you're saying is everybody can use the commons, including IBM. So IBM dominates the Linux economy. Maybe you don't find that any problem, but that's the reality, right? The reality is using these entirely open licenses is immediately the big players that use these commonses and start dominating the markets around these commonses. So we're proposing something called copy fair. And copy fair is a type of licenses which allows full sharing of knowledge, but makes commercialization conditional on contribution. Now, I see Lawrence is there, and maybe it would be an idea for the Creative Commons, but probably they're against it. But I'll make the case, because now you only have a choice between non-commercial and commercial. There's nothing in between. So either you can commercialize or you can commercialize. But in software, that's no problem, because you're a young developer, you can stay with your parents until you're 40, like they do in Italy, right? It's not a problem. But if you want to make a Wikihouse or a Wikispeed car, you need a space, you need 3D printing machines, you need raw material. So the idea that somebody is going to immediately dominate that space with much more resources is something that is seen as problematic, right? Which is why most of the solidarity economy, most of the cooperative economy is not using open licenses, because they're afraid, right? So if you want to converge these fair models with the open models, we need, I think, something new, and that is the copy fair licenses. So I'm thinking in terms of the blockchain, but not being an expert, that maybe these could be embedded as smart contracts within the blockchain. I don't know, but this is a potential application. A third one, common fair. Here you're very lucky in Australia, right? You smoothed through the global breakdown of 2008. You still have free healthcare and all the goodies from the welfare state. But as you know, this is certainly not the case in Europe. Since 2013, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands declared that it's the end of the welfare state, right? And paradoxically, they use peer-to-peer language to justify this, right? Basically, what they're saying is, oh, well, you can do it yourself now, right? So let's cut the health budget by 1/3 and decentralize it, and there you go. Let's close the libraries because you can take care of it, and it's called participation. So basically, the fastest growing sociological category in Western countries are the so-called independent entrepreneurs. 25% in the Netherlands, going soon to 1/3 of the population. But they're also the fastest pauperizing category in our societies. They're getting poorest the fastest, right? Because the welfare institutions, which are declining anyway, are not taking care of these people. And this is, something that we could also critique the left for, right? Because they haven't been doing this. They haven't been thinking about extending the security for these independent workers. And so we get these absurd things like proletarians of the 20th century, the taxi drivers, fighting against the proletarians of the 21st century, the Uber drivers. This is what's happening today, right? But so people are not waiting, right? So these ethical entrepreneurial coalitions are developing new methods of solidarity, which, by the way, resemble very much the old ways of solidarity of the 19th century. For example, the Bread Fund in the Netherlands, you pay €75 a month. When you're sick, you get €750. You need a group of 50 people. For example, Solidago, exponentially growing alternative medicine insurance in Germany. For example, Friendsurance, which allows you to connect with your network, pay €32 a month, you covered up to €10,000, which makes your health insurance 50%. So here's another potential application for the blockchain. Can we encode these solidarity mechanisms, which are pretty automatic, in something like the blockchain to make them really cheap to organize? And to create a layer, like an emergency layer of solidarity for independent workers in a context of declining solidarity mechanisms. Third one, and this is, I think, probably the most important thing, right? So here's my version, pop economics, Bauwens economics, of why the world is going to pieces. We think nature is infinite. So we have an infinite growth system in a finite physical environment. This is not going to work forever, right? So climate change, 4 out of the 12 biosystems, the famous donut, are in the red zone. 4 are going to be in the red zone in the next 30 years. So we are actively destroying our planet because of this infinite growth economics. Second, inequality is growing, not diminishing. So we now have, these wild bifurcations in politics in the US with Trump, in France with the National Front. So the 30s will soon look like a piece of cake and a holiday compared to what's coming. Then the second problem is that we think that we should make everything scarce, right? The market is a scarcity allocation mechanism, fine, it works, but capitalism has become a scarcity engineering system, right? Nowadays, if you're a farmer in the US and you buy a John Deere tractor, you don't own it. You actually rent the piece of software which you are forbidden to tamper with. So you can no longer repair your own machinery. In most countries of the world, farmers are now forbidden to use their own seeds in farming, and they have to buy Terminator seeds. So we have a system which is actively trying to make scarce what is actually abundant, right? So we have artificial scarcity. And then it's not fair. That's the third aspect. So here's my point, is that the potential of commons-based peer production actually solves those 3 problems on the condition that we create generative business models around it, right? That's the thesis. But particularly important, I think, is the sustainability issue, right? And this is one of the problems with blockchain and with Bitcoin, right? It's already using more electricity than the Republic of Ireland, more than all other social computing and supercomputers together. This is not part of a solution. This is part of a problem, right? So as much as we love the blockchain for its potential, we have an issue there that needs solving, and I know that people are working on this, so that's really important. But more fundamentally, I think that moving to these open contributory systems with ethical entrepreneurial coalitions puts things back in the right way. If we have a commons, we have no artificial scarcity. We recognize the natural abundance of knowledge, technology, and science, and so everybody, the whole world, all entrepreneurs, can build on it. And we know this works because we look at innovation graphs, we know this, right? Before patenting, steep innovation curve, patenting, flat innovation curve, after patenting, steep innovation curve. So we know this works. And this is what open source economics does. It starts from the basis of sharing knowledge so that it can be hyper-productive and grow very, very fast. Now, how does this work for design? This is very important. If we design in a company, no matter how good intentions we have, we will always design for planned obsolescence because we have to maintain the scarcity of our commodities. So Volkswagen, you know what happened. The Wikispeed open source car, there are 28 of them when I looked at it 3 years ago, has 5 times as much fuel efficiency as Volkswagen. Wikihouse, I spent a day with them in New Zealand. So here's the situation in New Zealand. 70% of the housing stock is toxic. It produces mold. People get sick from the mold. Solution is isolate the house. But because they're all using toxic building materials instead of mold, you get toxic fumes in your house. This has been going on for 30 years, and the regulatory reforms are blocked. But Wikihouse is an open platform for sustainable living, where all the knowledge of making positive carbon houses, diminishing air conditioning, diminishing heating needs, is all embedded in the building code of Wikihouse, right? So this is, you see immediately that when you place a design in an open design community, there is no incentive for planned obsolescence, for artificial scarcity. Then we can mutualize infrastructures, which is what the share economy is doing, which has huge effects on what we call thermodynamic efficiency, right? The ability to diminish the amount of matter and energy in the products and services that we make. And also very important is the following. So today we are playing sports, all of us, if we're in business. So we have all these little companies competing with each other. Within those companies, we have to work together in a hierarchical way or in a non-hierarchical way. But we have to work together, but we are fighting against everybody else. Now, if you have a commons and you have ethical entrepreneurs that are codependent of this shared resource, you create a basis of cooperation within which you can have competition, but the basis becomes cooperation, right? So the Linux economy, etc. Now, if you look at Inspiral and Las Indias in Spain and the Ethos Foundation in the UK and Sensorica in Canada and many others that I don't know, these new ethical entrepreneurial corporations, because they have this basis of cooperation, work in transparency together, right? So here's another very important issue. Open supply chains. How are you ever going to do a circular economy if the supply chains are secret? Right? How much time is it going to take to negotiate every single cooperation agreement to have circular economy flows? We don't have the time. On the other hand, if you operate in transparency, you can move very fast to open supply chains and open book accounting. And so seeing the whole network allows you to mutually adjust your behavior and processes to the network. So you're moving from supply chains to ecosystem thinking, right? And so here's the dream. So the way that Wikipedia and Linux work is often called stigmergy, right? Stigmergy, the language of the social insects, they follow signals. So what we can do in a football team, sing our team and the other team, and adjust our behavior in real time, now becomes possible at scale, right? But every physical product activity has a knowledge representation. So open supply chains and open book accounting are the representation of physical activities. So if we move to that model, we get stigmergy in physical production. So to summarize, what pricing is for the market, what decision making is for planning, mutual coordination becomes the thing for the commons economy. And here's the last one about sustainability. Very simple to explain. What is light is global. What is heavy is local, right? So if we match stigmergic mutual coordination to distributed manufacturing, we gain 2/3 with that alone in thermodynamic efficiency. Today, if you study not the financials, but the real flows of matter and energy, 2/3 is transportation. So if we can move to a model that produces locally on demand through microfactories, but collaborates globally so that every innovation can go anywhere in the world in a very fast way, we are going to obtain massive thermodynamic gains, right? And so we need this. You know, this is not just utopia. This is going to be a matter of survival. And this is not going to happen in the system that we have. We need to turn the logic on its head, have real abundance and real scarcity instead of pseudo-abundance and artificial scarcity. So there are now systems like Provenance and others that do open supply chains. So here's my last suggestion, because this would, I think, be revolutionary. Can we do open blockchain-based supply chains? Can we bring down dramatically the coordination and communication and transaction costs of massive mutual coordination of production on a world scale? So I think I'm going to stop here. But maybe, okay, one more argument, right? So, sorry, but it's just very short, because the lady is gone now, but this is important. So think about 68. What happened in 68? Young people and young workers were revolting against hierarchical institutions. And what happened is basically that the managerial class decided, well, we'll give young people their rock and roll, but we'll export our manufacturing to the global south, so we don't have to deal with that, right? This is what happened, which gave us neoliberal globalization. The result is, if you look at why our welfare systems is crumbling, it's also because the surplus value, right, is no longer produced, first of all, in the West. It's produced in the global south, but it's captured by financial institutions, and it's not coming back, which is a mutual problem for us and for them. If we move to global distributed manufacturing, what is happening also is that the surplus value goes back to where the people are actually creating it. So I think this is not just a solution for the Western people, but it's actually also a solution for the people in the global south. And the technology to do it is there and could be fundamentally augmented by using the blockchain in that context, right? So we have 3 tribes. I went to the Westpac blockchain workshop yesterday morning, or was it the day before? The day before. And very clearly, the way you look at the blockchain is we can save $20 billion a year in infrastructure cost and tap the 500 billion migration transfers. Fair enough. If you're libertarian, even though it doesn't work that way, your dream is to disintermediate the governments and the big banks. But there's a third tribe, which I would call humanity, that wants to solve environmental and social issues that are now coming to a head in our current system. And maybe, just maybe, we may need the blockchain to do this better and faster at a cheaper cost. So this is my presentation. Thank you. So is there room for questions? Yeah? Yeah, I don't know how this works, so I guess there are mics going around. No questions? Nobody? Oh, all right. Monique, there?
I have a mic already. I'm cutting in.
Oh, right. Okay.
Just a spontaneous one, because since I saw Philippa's presentation this morning and she mentioned meritocracy, and I've been thinking about meritocracy quite a bit, I would like to hear your take on meritocracy and its value or risk for decentralized society or governance.
Okay. Shall I maybe take 3 questions and then respond to 3 more? I cannot remember. I need a pen. Does anybody have a pen?
Thank you for your talk, Michel.
Oh, there you are. Yes.
It was very fascinating. So my question is about I guess, the process of building the layer of infrastructure to sit across the technology to enable, I guess, more equity to be built into it. Obviously, in the early days of the internet, people were very sort of optimistic about the potential for the technology. And how, I guess my question is, how can the infrastructure be approached differently this time to have a different outcome?
Okay, I'll let me answer those two as best as I can, because I wish I had all the answers. Yeah, meritocracy, that's a big issue. And I guess I would argue that, so if you look at the three things, the open source communities, the ethical entrepreneurial coalitions, and the for-benefit associations. Ideally, and most of them are, the for-benefit associations are democratic in a formal way, voting, stuff like that. The open source communities are usually meritocratic, right? They function with layers of people who are recognized as being the best. And for example, certainly in software and open design seems to work quite well. In Wikipedia, I would question whether it works that well, because actually what happens is that people who know the rules have more power than the experts who know the subject. But that's another discussion. So I think the way to, in any system you want to get a balance right, and it's very difficult, between inclusion and efficiency, right? Because all of us who have been in progressive movements, we know what's called the blob, right? The blob is where you talk all the time and nothing gets done. So it's a big issue. On the other hand, you have the other system which is very efficient, but there's no inclusion. So how do we get that thing right? And I think there's two options here. And they have to be at the boundary between the commons and the market, between the communities and the ethical entrepreneurial coalition. So that's where I think we can put in the fairness that balances out meritocracy with fair livelihood, right? And this is something that's really understudied, and I don't have time to do this, but there is a little group in Germany, and they have a very complicated name, and I should study what they do, but listen very carefully. It's the Counter Anti-Disintermediation Group. Isn't that nice, right? So basically what they're trying to do is, we have this promise of disintermediation through distributed structures. Doesn't work, it gets back to oligopoly. So what are today, instead of imprisoning the mayor of Dubrovnik or starving the headhunter, what are the tools today that we can insert, to create that fairness, right? And it doesn't have to be absolute equality, absolutely not, but you can kind of work on the edges. And I mentioned Jamendo, right? I did say that, right? So this is the kind of thing for me we have to work on. So find the balance right between, recognizing that some people are better at some things, while not creating this other huge pyramid. Because what we have now is winner-take-all systems, right? So if you don't look at this is what you get. You get Linux, it's made by everyone, and then Linus Torvald gets a villa from IBM or whatever they did, I forgot. But so this is what you want to avoid. You want to create systems that I think recognize meritocracy, because some people are better than others in certain things. And if you don't recognize that, then you get bad production and inefficient production. At the same time, how can this be balanced out with fairness? I think I don't have the precise answer, but this is my thinking about this. Actually, my answer is the same. I only have one tune, I guess. Equity in infrastructure is also about embedding those rules in the way we design systems, right? It's the same problem. And this is something that we don't think about today. It's really weird that we don't think about this. Right? We just build the distributed infrastructures, hoping that things will get okay, and then they don't. And it's like we're not learning how to do this yet, and this is very important. But I think if you look at the ethical entrepreneur coalitions like in Spiral, that is exactly what they're looking at, what they're doing, because they have this commitment, you know, to mutual aid and fairness within their organizations. They have foundational documents, and they filter out proposals from the outside to the degree that it doesn't endanger their primary logic. Think about the Amish, right? New technology comes along, you look it up in the Bible, and the elders discuss whether it undermines their community or not, right? So they have an active mastery of technological adoption. So for example, in Spiral, just for the gossip here, they got their first impact bond, which completely respects their independence. They accept. They won't accept venture capital. But they propose now something called capped investments, which I really like as an idea. They say, you know, if you invest in us, you'll get 10 times your investment, but then it's capped, and then we'll ceremoniously gift it to the commons, and we'll honor you for it. So, our world consists of a very tiny group of ethical entrepreneurs and a huge group of extractive entrepreneurs, right? If you're too antagonistic, then you get civil war. We don't want that. But we can build transitional measures, right? So when IBM went into Linux, they discovered that their hierarchy didn't work for the rapidity of software development in an open source community, and they had to adopt the rules and norms of Linux in order to work with it. So we can find ways of cooperation, transitional measures, in which all the money that is in the rent extraction economy can be invested in solutions for social environmental problems in a way that socializes and culturalizes extractive businesses in a more moral economy. Does that make sense? So that's the general idea. I see somebody out there with a Hawaii shirt. That's the way it looks from here.
So this kind of follows on with what you were just talking about, I think, which is to what extent is this a matter of the construction of the system? How much is this sort of built-in mechanisms to regulate the system once it's running? What are these kinds of techniques that we can do? And I really like what you had to say about the ways in which the extractive measures are taking the product of this collective, but not reinvesting in its innovation. And I'm wondering if there's something like a progressive tax that you could impose through the blockchain itself in some of these systems that would force sort of innovative reinvestment at that level.
Well, I haven't really thought about that one. It seems like a brilliant idea. By the way, so if you look at our wiki, we have 250 practices and concepts around contributory accounting. We have another 300-400 about P2P legal. We also have P2P taxation. So I can't really give you the answer directly, but I know people are working on this. I just haven't had the time to delve into it recently. But one thing we have to know is that even commons are selfish, right? You can also have network imperialism. So in Spiral, even though it wants to do good, and it does, it's also primarily interested in supporting its own community. So I personally think we still need collective entities at the territorial level to maintain, you know, the balance flows across the networks and the territories. I'll give you an example. So for me, the city is now the key area where this is happening, right? You have Sharing City Seoul, you have Bologna, City of the Commons, you have Barcelona, Fab City 5.0. So what you see is cities are acting very actively in this transition. And the most beautiful example is probably Bologna with its Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. Yes, it's a mouthful, which allows neighborhood collectives to propose policies to improve their streets and squares, etc. There's a review process, and then there's a negotiation between the city and the collectives about how to do this in the best way. And the city becomes a partner city, a for-benefit association for the commons that is the city, right? So it's the same model of peer production but applied to a territory. And here's what could happen. I'm not saying it is happening, but it could happen. Imagine that the best neighborhoods with the smartest people have the best ideas to improve their neighborhood, while the poor neighborhoods where everybody is struggling, they maybe don't have the time to do this. Does that make sense, right? So if you just leave it like that, I think you may also have perverse effects. So you still need, in my view, a city that looks at the totality, right? You always need holistic mechanisms that go beyond the separate entities. And so, yeah, I see the city as one of those places where you have to look at, you know, if you look at history again, in the Middle Ages, before Adam Smith, we had a moral economy and the idea of a just price. So all the prices were socially determined for a very simple reason. If people can't buy the grain in a city, they riot. And you are there, right? So you can't escape anywhere, right? So I think cities are really good places because it's much more difficult to do perverse politics in a city where, you know, the effects of inequality are just so apparent and potentially so damaging for everyone that you want to maintain these balances in terms of policy.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much for the talk. The thing I was very interested in was what you said about the loss of transportation of goods from one point to another. Now, when you think about it, like we're digging holes in our country, taking vast amount of material out to go, say, for instance, to Korea, then they produce the steel and then send us the cars back. Okay. Now, the whole thing about it was the good producers or the certain people who could produce those items more efficient. It was better for the countries to let those industries flourish in the countries, and the other countries that, say, for instance, are doing just clothing. And you're talking about my Hawaiian shirt that was probably not made, well, this one might have been made in Hawaii, or it was probably made in the South American country near Hawaii. That turns everything on its head because you're saying large goods local, small goods to be moved. I'm just trying to fathom how that's going to, because you're virtually going to be turning everything on its head. Right. And also, too, we've got the burdening increase of the middle class, which is probably the world's greatest fear at the moment. It's not the increase of population, it's the actual increasing middle class who want goods. And they'll in India and China, well, you know, all different countries, the population's now getting